So today's workshop is about how to use big data to measure migration flows. And we have two presenters today. We have Ettore RECCHI, who is going to start today, who is professor of sociology at Sciences Po. So his main research interests are about human mobility, social stratification, elites, and European integration. And today he's here as one of the leaders of this big research project on global mobility project, who is going to be the topic of his talk today, which is basically a large-scale assemblage and analysis of data on human mobility using diverse sources of data. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting for us to know more about how to use this data to measure migration. Then I will give the floor to Aliakbar AKBARITABAR, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute. I will tell more about your work later on, Ali. We are very happy also to have you today. So the way we usually do is have a 40-minute or 45-minute presentation followed by Q&A that you can ask by raising your hand in the Zoom, or you can also use the chat box if you want, and we can tell the question for you. If you have any clarification question during the presentation, please raise your hand using the button on the Zoom, and then you can ask your question. Otherwise, we do all the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So, Ettore, I give you the floor for 40-45 minutes. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the nice introduction. Thanks for having me today. I'm delighted to join in, also because I'm a fellow of ICM, and it's a way of giving back this prestigious status. I think, speaking about affiliation, as you said, I'm professor at Sciences Po. I also have a double affiliation with the UI. I'm a visiting fellow at Migration Policy Center. And what I'm presenting today is part of what I've been doing over the last 3 years at the Migration Policy Center, where I launched this project that you introduced called the Global Mobilities Project. I basically present the two data sets that we have produced so far as part of the project. A few words of introduction about my theoretical approach and framing of the whole issues I'll be talking about. I adopted transnational mobility perspective. Why that? Because there is a meta-theoretical rationale. I think that speaking about transnational mobility is a way of debunking the prevailing framing of migrants as a distinct category of human beings, which is the basis of all narratives and rhetorics that contrast them with us. Mobility is something that we all engage in and doesn't lead to the distinction between people who don't migrate and people who migrate. Everybody is a mover, and that's a baseline. Theoretically, I think that placing the emphasis on mobility in migration research corrects the settlement bias, as it was called, of traditional migration studies. It's a way of being skeptical of the fact that all foreigners are here to stay. As Janine Dainden happened to say, it's a way of demigrantizing migration. And finally, conceptually, I think of migration with a minimal definition. To me, migration is mobility plus settlement. And in this basic equation, you have to study mobility per se if you want to understand and capture migration. Each act of international migration starts from a cross-border movement. In line with this definition, I think we could ideally classify all forms of human mobility in this bidimensional space, depending on the distance of a space travel, from intercontinental travel to limited metropolitan commuting, and according to the duration of travel, from a long-term stay to a daily trip. So we can think of any mobility experience and place it somehow into this diagram. I'm not pursuing this line of thought today, but this is just a way of giving a background picture of how I conceptualize migration as a subset of all possible forms of human mobility. I think that collecting human mobility data can also help and support more traditional migration research on migrants, on settled movers, so to speak. Mobility data can be thought of as symptomatic data that indicate three things: a potential for migration, because we know that every migration is inscribed into pre-existing mobility routes. Last year, we published with the people I'm working with in the Global Mobilities Project, Lorenzo Gabrielli, Emanuel Deutschmann, Michele Vespe, and others, a paper showing that we could infer seasonal, temporary migration patterns through mobility data without knowing much about settlements. A second possible contribution to traditional migration research is that mobility data can inform us about the potential for transit, especially when international migration is a stepwise process. We know which routes are more likely to be followed by possible migrants. And third, and possibly most evident, mobility data on a global scale or on a regional scale show which countries are closer to each other, and also geopolitical clusterings or equilibria through the flows of human mobility, which also entail human contacts. So this was a sort of prologue. Let me tell you a few words about the project itself. The project was launched in late 2017, starting in 2018, with the idea of creating a comprehensive global database of the many different forms of human transnational mobility. Here you have the address of the website, where you can also download the data sets that are being produced and the different papers that are being produced over time. The project intends to cover 4 different dimensions of global mobilities, plural: a demographic dimension, which I will talk about extensively today; an economic dimension, which I will only touch upon tangentially today. In the pipeline, we have a paper and the data set on the global cost of travel; the legal political aspects, and I will talk about it today in the second part of my talk, talking about visas; and the cultural aspects, what we may think of as transnational social remittances, but we haven't started this part of the project so far. The goals are, there are several goals in the project, and the most important is to create a platform where, which is open access and which can pave the way to further analysis by any researcher who has an interest in mobility and migration, creating standardized data sets, tapping from different sources, thereby increasing comparability and facilitating original comparative analysis. So far we have released 2 data sets and some papers that draw on these 2 data sets. The first data set is a data set that offers an overview of a country-to-country volume of travel, of human travel, from 2011 to 2016. We call these the Global Transnational Mobility Data Set. And then the second data set that we talk about is a data set about the cost of visas. So let me speak about this first data set. It was created in collaboration with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, which provided data and expertise. And the data set can be downloaded for free from the GNP website, but also from the KCMD data repository of the Joint Research Center, the Knowledge Center on Migration and Demography. They also made the data set interactive so that you can create visualization using the data set without downloading the whole data. What we have in this data set is the number of travel per calendar year from and to 196 countries. This dyadic matrix is composed, therefore, of 38,000 country pairs, and it ends up covering more than 15 billion trips over these 6 years. What can we do with these data? We can think of how different forms of mobility are related to each other. For instance, a pending question is, what is the relationship between virtual mobility, that is, for instance, social media contacts or email contacts between countries, and physical mobility? Does the increase in virtual mobility reduce or amplify spatial mobility? Actually, we don't have a firm answer to this question so far. What is the relation between global mobilities and inequalities? And we can also carry out case studies of specific regions of mobility. We recently published with Emanuel Deutschmann and Federica Bicchi a paper on human mobility across the Mediterranean, actually with a longer time span from 1995 till 2015, showing that even in terms of legal mobility, legally possible human mobility, the Mediterranean has been dividing the south of the north, and people are less likely to travel from north to south and from south to north over the last 2 decades. Now, given the scope and the goal of these workshop and the working group, I will walk you through the kitchen of a construction of this data set. This data set was constructed tapping on 2 very different sources. The first one is a collection of national statistics on tourism, which is provided by the United Nations World Tourism Organization. Beware, it's called UNWTO, but it's not the World Trade Organization. It's a separate agency of the UN, less well known than the WTO. It is based in Madrid, but it operates on tourism, and it collects yearly national statistics from national governments and agencies, which are rather detailed on the number of people visiting or entering any given country. And the second source is a commercial data set, which is for sale, and it's rather expensive actually, by a company based in Texas, Sabre, which draws data and collects data from all airline reservation systems. Basically, when you book a flight, the information that you're flying from Paris to Florence, for instance, enter a booking platform, and eventually is channeled to the Sabre data set on a monthly basis. So we clean, systematize, and harmonize these two sources, and we merge them. And I want to say a few extra words on the merging procedure. This is the typical UNWTO country file on tourism. By tourists, by the way, the UNWTO means any non-resident visitor. So it's not only people who travel for leisure, it's anybody crossing national borders, not being a resident of the country. And you see, this is for Botswana. There are lots of missing, and that's a major problem. If there weren't any missing, we had probably used the UNWTO data straightforwardly. But the number of missing obliged us to look for a complementary source. And the complementary source is Sabre data on air travels, which is very fine-grained. It details the number of travelers through airlines, along airline routes between airports, but we compacted them into country pairs. So the left-hand panel of this slide shows the workflows from the raw data till the global transnational mobility data set. Basically, we had these two sources, and we transformed them progressively. As for the UNWTO data, we had first to prioritize the kind of information we wanted to process, and because we had different definitions of tourists and visitors in the data set, but not all country files were perfectly compatible. So we had to choose between the different available information. Then we created a unified Excel file with all the 196 available countries. And then we added information about returning residents, which are not included in the original file, but we could extrapolate the number of returning residents, knowing how many people left and went visiting from country A to country B. And we assume that these people returned over the year to the country of origin. As for the Sabre data, we actually didn't take the raw data, the observed data, because for a number of reasons, one of which is that Sabre is very keen on avoiding any possibility of reverse engineering of the data set. So to avoid these basically, but also for other technical reasons, we deseasonalized the data and we excluded the residuals, and we took a trend information about airline, the volume of airline travels. But then we did an additional transformation, because what we wanted was some sort of alternative or measurement of cross-border movements, which could be equated to the UNWTO travel data, tourist data. So we noticed and we realized actually that in most cases, the number of air passengers and the number of tourists recorded by UNWTO data coincided. All the dots that you see in this graph on the right-hand side of a slide represent country pairs. And you see that the majority of country pairs are in orange. And when they are orange, it means that there is a non-significant difference from zero in the comparison of air passengers and tourists. Other colors denote more significant differences. And there are a few outliers which are quite significant. The colors also denote the year of the data. And the most significant outliers are Hong Kong and China, Poland and Germany, Macau and China, the US and Mexico. As you realize, all these countries are countries with huge cross-border movements, and are also countries that are neighboring countries. And that makes sense. In neighboring countries, not so many people take a plane to cross borders. That's not actually, it's very implausible, for instance, between Hong Kong and China. So there is a lot of border crossing by land. So what we looked for was a correction factor of airline passenger data that could account for distance and adjust the estimation potential of air passenger data depending on distance. And we found out that we found this correction factor, and we applied this correction factor in order to make air passenger data a better estimator of actual tourist data. And imagine, for instance, two neighboring countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, the correction factor is up to 6. So for every person taking a plane, there are 5 that cross the border by land. The farther you go, the lower is the correction factor. And already at 5,000 kilometers of distance, the correction factor is next to 1. So there's no correction factor. At the end of this adjustment procedure, we reached this sort of very high correlation, over 80%, 0.8 correlation between tourist data and distance adjusted air passenger data, which made one substitutable with the other. And so this reached our goal of filling the missing data with any other of the two sources, making the two sources interchangeable. In this way, eventually, we could fill up the large majority of our country diets with either one or the other of the two sources. And basically, at the end of the day, 86% of our cases drew on air passenger data. But if you count the number of travel, the majority of the largest number of travel were covered with tourist data, which means that air passenger data serve to fill the gaps of countries with lower number of tourists and or the combination with lower number of travelers, whereas the UNWTO data serve to cover the flows between countries with large number of travelers. And here we have our estimates. Basically, depending on using the global transnational mobility data set, we estimate that in 2016 there were almost 3 billion cross-border movements on this planet, which expands a lot on previous estimates, which were based only on tourists or air passengers, which hover around 1.2 billion. You can also notice from this right-hand panel of a slide that the magnitude of mobility episodes dwarfs the number of flows, of the size of flows for asylum seekers, refugees, or migrants, which are in between 2 and 22, 23 million of people, actually, of travels. A major takeaway from these data sets so far is that before the pandemic, global mobility was growing at a very fast and steady pace. There were 2.3 billion cross-border travel in 2011. There were 2.9 in 2016, which is a growth rate of 5% per year, which is much larger, for instance, of the yearly growth rate of the world population. Another major takeaway is that the bulk of global mobility takes place on a regional scale. Intra-regional mobility is much larger, especially in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, than interregional mobility. Europe takes the lead and Asia follows on both grounds, both in terms of intra-regional mobility and interregional mobility. And these two continents are the real drivers of the growth of global mobility altogether. Using the same data, Emanuel Deutschmann, who is my principal collaborator in this project, has carried out a community detection algorithm analysis of a network of global mobility and found out that there are basically 6 global clusters. And these clusters of mobility, where mobility predominantly takes place, corresponds largely to continents: Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia and Oceania, hinging on China, the Middle East, and Eurasia, which is a middle ground hinging on Russia, involving some Asian country and some Eastern European countries. We can replicate the same kind of analysis on a subset of the data. In this case, we did it in Africa, and quite clearly we could distinguish 4 distinct clusters of human mobility. In South Africa, the largest of the 4, hinging on the country called South Africa, but also involving Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Angola, Malawi, but also Madagascar, Mauritius, and the Seychelles, Northern Africa, East Africa, and West Africa. It's a quite unequal mobility structure, because I think that overall the mobility gravitating around South Africa is several times larger than the mobility taking place elsewhere in the continent. A similar exercise has been performed in a paper not yet published by Emanuel Deutschmann and myself, and this time we focused on Europe, actually on the EU more than Europe, and the EU including also Britain, and because the data are for 2016, it turns out that Germany really stands at the center of the whole network of human mobility flows within the EU, and there is some sort of a leading triangle of mobility between the UK, Spain, and Germany, which is sitting over minor mobility routes within it, including France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Eastern Europe and some parts of Southern Europe, with the exception of Spain and to some extent Italy, and Northern Europe look like being more marginal areas, giving the impression that there is some sort of center-periphery logic in the human mobility within the EU. We haven't carried out any causal analysis for a number of issues, mostly endogeneity, but we have some correlates of a volume of human mobility globally and other factors, geographic factors, social demographic factors, economic factors, political factors, and development and globalization factors. One of the major results of these correlation analyses is that political factors don't count that much. Mobility is not particularly hindered or boosted depending on the level of freedom and stability of countries. What matters the most is economic development, the presence of infrastructures, for instance, the number of airports, population size, but this is quite straightforward. And also, and this is interesting in the framework of this talk, the stock rate of the receiving and sending countries. That is the stock rate of immigrants, the immigrant stock rate, which reinforces the idea that mobility and migration go hand in hand. This graph shows for Europe only the correlation between GDP per capita and the number of travel per country. And you can see that on average, residents of Luxembourg carried out in the past, before COVID, about 16 cross-border travels per year. That also depends on the size of the country, of course. Whereas residents of Turkey, Bosnia, the Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Romania, on average, carried out less than one trip per year. But the correlation is quite strong, is 0.69. Okay, let me now speak about the second data set, maybe more rapidly. It's a data set that collects the cost of visa for all possible country pairs worldwide. Again, this was a mixed method data collection. We did it manually, retrieving data from governmental website and also consulate website in 2019 for tourism, study, business, work, family, reunification, transit, and other motive visas. We didn't factor in costs for additional requirements. For instance, cash needed to be accepted to enter the country, or hotel bookings that are also required by some countries to enter the country. We didn't consider that. But we also adopted the web scraping procedure. As you may know, online you can find specialized agencies that offer to get you a visa with an additional fee. And we could scrape one of these online agencies, and we could collect and create a separate data set with 7,700 visa cost information. And what we found out is that, in fact, this particular online agency systematically overcharges for a visa demand. So if you, on top of the agency fees, so they charge you agency fees, but they also charge you for a raw cost of a visa more than a consulate would actually charge you. I can plainly say that they cheat the customer to some extent. So for these reasons, we eventually decided to discard this information and rely on manually retrieved data from government and consulate websites. We ended up creating a data set with the cost of visas for a the cost of 85,000 visas for tourist, business, and the other categories of visas. We have some missing data, but overall, we have information for 65% of all possible combinations of countries, which is very much in line with the previously comparable data set, the visa network data set created by Stephen Mao and collaborators in 2015. The difference between our data set and theirs is that we have the cost, whereas they only had information whether a visa was needed or not. So they had a dichotomous information by cell in the matrix. Major takeaways. We have published a paper in Political Geography this year, 2021, analyzing this data set. We found out that visas are cheaper or even no cost, depending on the probability of migration. So transit visas are free in 75% of cases, tourist visas in 49%, business visas in 40% of the cases, and work visas only in 24% of the cases. And also the mean cost of visas grows as long as we move from transit to work visas. We also found out that visas are cheaper for citizens of more developed and richer countries. So in absolute terms, if you live in Western Europe, you're a citizen of Western Europe, your average visa costs about $15 US dollars. If you are a citizen of a Southern Asian country or North African country, it will cost you on average more than $50. We found some sort of a Matthew effect law in visa cost. There is a linear relationship between the cost of visas and the GDP per capita of the country. The higher the GDP per capita, the lower the visa cost in absolute terms. But this is even amplified if you looked at the cost of visa with a different metric, which is the number of working days needed to buy a visa. So if you come from Northern Europe or from Australia, a visa costs you less than 1 hour of average work, less than average work hour based on average salaries. If you come from sub-Saharan Africa, with exclusion of South Africa, or from some parts of Asia, a visa, the average visa could cost you more than 70 days of work. So there is a major inequality already in this little piece of paper, which doesn't, by the way, I want to highlight this, doesn't guarantee access, because what you pay for is the visa application. These are visa application fees, but you can, there are very few cases in which this is refunded if entry into the country is denied. This is a little bit complicated graph, but it's, it seems to me the last graph I will be presenting, it's a graph that tries to keep together two information. The cost of visa to enter the country and the amount of visas depending on the potential country of arrival. So the size of the balls, let's call them balls or dots, indicates how expensive is a visa to enter that particular continent. So visas are more expensive than average in North America, which is no surprise, and in Africa, which is a little bit of a surprise. They're in fact less expensive in Latin America, Europe, Oceania, and Asia. And the arrows show how much it costs to ask for a visa from a given origin to a given destination. For instance, visas are quite cheap if you want to go from Europe to North America. For Europeans, visas are cheap, whatever the destination. And Europeans, as you all know, also enjoy a lot of visa waivers. Whereas for Africans, visas are expensive in absolute terms, not in relative terms, even more in relative terms, whatever the chosen destination. I'm concluding, and I want to conclude with a few caveats. Both for the global transnational mobility data set on the flows of travel between countries, we have to consider our figures are conservative estimates. For one reason, we exclude daily cross-border commuting. We don't have information on that. And we exclude irregular migration. For the global visa cost data set, again, these are conservative estimates. Also because, as I said, we don't include additional costs that are needed to apply for a visa or eventually get a visa and make the visa valid to enter the country. For instance, showing proof of having sufficient resources to spend some time in that country, even as a tourist. There is an additional point that I want to stress. These data were collected immediately before the pandemic. We ended our data collection in December 2019. I'm really curious. I wonder whether things will be changing after the pandemic, and whether, as I suspect, health concerns might tighten borders further, independently of merely virus-related concerns. Another caveat is that we don't have any case-by-case checks on the accuracy of our figures. We trust our sources, but the data sets are geared to a global or regional take on mobility, and are meant to be associated with similar large-scale macro information on national flows. Nonetheless, we think, as a research group, that these are quite unprecedented data sets to explore cross-border travel with a global perspective. And I really take the occasion to invite all participants and all people they know to get the data and exploit them in their own research. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ettore. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. So we can now take some questions. I don't know if some of you do have some question. You can use the raise your hand button if you do, and I can give you the floor. I can see the chat. No? Yes, go ahead, Hillel. I have some myself.
Okay, sorry, I don't know how to use the hand button. Yeah, I always forget where it is. So I just raise my hand. No, very, very interesting. And to end with your last invitation, I will definitely join the community of users. I have currently a paper on business travel and trade, so I will definitely look at the additional controls and maybe alternative data I can find in your project, which I find very ambitious and certainly filling a gap. I have mostly comments on the presentation rather than on the data itself. Just two small points really for the presentation. When you showed the graph on prosperity and move, we'd like at least a control for country size, because obviously the smaller country will tend to travel more, and you can, small countries, small problems, and so you'd like to need that out. And I'm not sure student migration is more permanent than family migration. My prior would be the opposite. So I just wonder whether you want it really linearity and monotonicity in your relationship, and you didn't flip those two just for beauty rather than for substance.
Great to see you, Leo.
Sorry, I had another point, sorry, on the Matthew effect. There is another way to present it. So you show more inequality, you're poor, you pay more. But if you think that as a visa agency, you have a monopoly, you charge the price you want and you want to maximize profits, so you're a discriminative monopoly, then you charge more those who are ready to pay more. And maybe people coming from poor countries have more to gain from migration and so are ready to pay more. And maybe that's an alternative, I don't know, maybe more correct, but maybe complementary interpretation of your finding.
Okay. Well, first, great to see you, Lel. And yeah, definitely. The first graph, the graph showing the association between GDP and a number of average travel is a very simplified graph. It's taken from a chapter we have written for teaching purposes, so it doesn't go in greater depth, but definitely country size is country size, both geographically, also the size of residents counts as well. So yeah, we need extra control, that's for sure. The second point about student mobility, so I think you refer to the visa cost, that student costs are easier to get than or more cheaper than family unification costs. That's the point. The other way around.
You said the cost goes up with the length of migration, and you classified student as more permanent than family. I think because the cost is higher rather than.
There was a mistake in what I said. That's not what I meant to. My interpretation was no. It's not the length of stay. Is the I would say the probability of transforming mobility into migration.
Yeah. So that's my point. I think it's more likely that someone who comes on a family entry track stays more than someone coming on the student track. It's a very minor point, but in terms of presentation, I think it's okay if you have a small inconsistency in the relationship there.
Okay. And the last point, can you repeat it?
It's on discrimination.
Oh yeah.
Monopoly rather
interpretation
than
of the Matthew effect.
Yeah.
Actually, in the whole paper and the whole framing of the issue, we look at visa cost as forms of dissuasion which is possibly the flip coin of what you say. You raise the cost to dissuade people from coming. So it's a more let's say politically oriented interpretation rather than an economically oriented. We draw models in the paper in which we test different possible explanation for the cost, and the most powerful explanation is reciprocity. So, which may also explain why Africa charges so much, because there is a dissuasion mechanism towards Africans in raising the cost of visa, and there is this reciprocity mechanism by which African states put higher visa cost on others. Then there are also additional minor explanation, the work, for instance, cultural affinity, or having a common colonial past, but reciprocity is the king explanation.
Thank you, Ettore. Thank you, Hillel. Is there any other question from the floor? Yes, How Donkey, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have two questions. One question regarding the correction factor that you introduced. So you showed three examples, if I remember correctly. One is Poland, Germany, Mexico, the US, and China, Macau, China, Hong Kong. They are basically the same in terms of geography. Yeah. Germany, Poland makes sense to me. Much of the travel perhaps is on the ground. China, Hong Kong, China, Macau, it's likely that you go through the land if you live in China where it's close to those regions, right? How do you deal with, the travel flows for instance, northern part of the country or west, which is very distant from Macau and Hong Kong? Is it possible that you do this correction factor by airports instead of just simply by, China versus Hong Kong or Macau? The second question is concerning the graph you showed at the very end of the presentation in terms of how much people, the ranking of the visa costs. For Europeans, it's cheaper. For people from less developed world, it's more expensive. Clearly, this variation could be at least driven by two sources, right? One is the probability you need to apply for a visa, right? Europeans have a lot of visa waiver programs when they travel, right? And the other is the visa costs, say. So I wonder if you have kind of distinguished between these two. One example is, for instance, when I travel, I need to apply for like 90% of the country I travel to, I need to apply for visa. But usually every single visa costs me about $30 or $40. But my friends living in Europe, they can travel to 90% of the countries without visa. But one country, for instance, if they travel to China, each visa will cost them $200. So I think there's a difference here. So I wonder if your analysis has kind of distinguished between these two components. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ettore?
Thank you, Dong. Yeah, what you say makes a lot of sense. So thanks for raising these issues. We could split countries by areas because using the airline data, we have information about the airports. We didn't do it for two reasons. One reason is for the sake of simplicity. And the second reason, because we were kind of inhibited from doing that by the data owners, because they don't want to have, as I said during the presentation, reverse engineering. So they don't want people to get this free data and go back to their data set, which costs $30,000 for free. So in principle, what you say makes sense and it's doable. I mean, we could distinguish travel from different regions of different countries, including China or the United States. I mean, for big countries, that makes a lot of sense. It makes less sense for smaller countries, but we didn't do it and we couldn't do it. As for visa waivers, thanks for raising this issue, because actually in our data set, we treat visa waivers as zero cost. So a visa waiver means a visa costs $0.
That's why I see lower average cost, right?
This makes, I mean, people who use our data set could also transform the data set in binary form. So they have zero cost means visa waiver. And this would make the data set comparable with the previous data set, particularly the one I mentioned by Stephen Mao, which has information about visa waivers in 2010 and in 1969. So you could also have a time series and see, actually we did this, but we didn't publish it. You can see how visa waivers vary over time and do some sort of longitudinal analysis. The second part of your second question mentioned some sort of potential volatility in a sense of cost. I mean, you say, to me, a visa costs about $30, $40 wherever I go. For Europeans, it can range from 0 to 200. That's another potential avenue of analysis. We didn't go that road so far, but it's interesting. Maybe some sending countries have a huge variability or volatility of cost, and others are quite a stable range. And we may speculate, maybe countries that are more conflictual. I don't know. I'm just thinking loud. Have more.
I mean, some countries have the policy like they charge two prices for developed world, for developing countries, right? So yeah.
And that goes very much along the lines of a reciprocity rule that I mentioned before.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is there any other questions from the floor? I have a couple of questions myself, so I'm going to take 2 minutes to ask you also. So I was also interested in this correction factor that you presented us, but mostly because it reminds me that sometimes the error itself is a source of information. So I was wondering what kind of information you get from the discrepancy between the two data sets. Could it be a proxy for how spongious is the border, or is there some source of information that you can get from the errors between the two data sets that you try to correct, but that may also be interested to use as a source of information? And my second question has to do with the cost of visa, because I mean, part of the cost of visa is not money, it's time, right? Is how far away you are from the consulate, which is not the same if you live in Paris and if you live in Bamako or whatever. Is how long is the queue and how long is. So I was wondering whether you can have some proxies for that, and if you some source of correction as well for this kind of cost in getting a visa.
Very interesting question, Lisa. As for the first one, I think the most important factor behind the discrepancy is geographical proximity and migration pressure. I think these two ingredients make up for the discrepancy. They're not captured well enough by the airline travel data, whereas the tourist data, knowing that tourist doesn't mean tourist as in plain language. Tourist for it means simply travel, whatever the objective, the scope of travel, is much more faithful to the fact that travel can be also migration related. As for the second point, at some point we thought of making some little experiments, but this would really be an integration, a mixed method thing. Experiments about the length, how much time it takes from the applying for a visa and having a reply. We wanted to send out mails to different consulates and see how long it takes to respond, to add some sort of additional information on difficulty of getting a visa. This might be a separate project. This could be a great integration of the data. We didn't do it, but definitely you're right. I mean, the visa cost is just one of the many pieces that form the border control that is epitomized by visas. There is more than cost. Cost is simply an indicator, but there are more elements to make mobility easier or not. So very good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ettore. Albert, you can take 1 or 2 minutes, and then we will listen to Ali's presentation. Go ahead.
Sorry, I can't start my video. I have a problem with the camera.
No problem.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, of course, the movements, the regular seasonal movements, indeed trending, that kind of has a very distinct pattern. But after the COVID, I'm guessing that this pattern got completely chaotic, and there are many factors now affecting the trends, including, for example, whether a country is adopting a particular vaccine and the other country is accepting that and things like that. Do you think that this kind of analysis can be continued into the COVID times, and what kind of processing will be needed to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Albert. This is the question I'm playing with since the pandemic started. So actually, we had in the cards of replicating the analysis in 2020 to 2021, and we discarded it and said, oh, let's do it once all this mess is over and see whether the post-pandemic world resembles or not the pre-pandemic world in terms of mobility. So this is still a plan. I think I would like to pursue it at some point, but you're right. I mean, it's very likely. I think, but this is just a guess. My guess is that the demand for travel and the kind of anthropological appetite for mobility will not be stemmed by the pandemic. What will change most likely is, as you hinted at, is the level of control and the scope of limitations that will be introduced to channel or filter out potential movers and migrants.
Thank you, Ettore. Thank you very much. So I propose that we now switch to the second presentation of this session by Aliakbar AKBARITABAR, who is a research scientist, postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute of Demographic Research in Germany. So Ali holds a PhD in economic and sociology from the University of Milan in Italy, and he works on topics related to the science of science, to scholar migration, which is the topic of today's talk, on social networks and computational social science more generally. So the work he is going to present today is about the study of the mobility of scholars using bibliometric data that are geocoded for scholars affiliation. So Ali, the floor is yours. If you want to share your slides, maybe with us. Thank you. Perfect.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, and thank you, Professor Recchi. It was an interesting talk and I learned so much. I'm going to talk about a study that together with Xinyi, Zhao and Emilio Zaghini, we have done it here. And this has to do with internal and international scholarly mobility and migration. So in our institute, there are other colleagues and some scholars who have previously affiliated to our institute who are now in elsewhere, who have worked on this subject, and they have been working on different granularity levels or trying to tackle different questions regarding scholarly mobility. And that includes Emilio, Andrea, Samin, Ebru, Mache, Tom, and Xinyi. Below you see a list of publications that has been published by my colleagues. And you might be interested to know, for example, that there has been studies specifically on internal scholarly migration in Mexico, for example, between different regions, or in Germany, return migration, and similar to those. So as an outline for the talk, I'm going to talk to you briefly on theoretical and methodological inspirations of our work. Then I will talk to you about data, the pre-processing and the repurposing that needs to happen, because it is a workshop on how to use the data as well. Then I will talk briefly about a methodological prototype and framework that we are still investigating, that we are still developing that. There I will showcase how it is supposed to work. And then the next part is the more developed part of the results that has to do with global mobility based on bibliometric data. And in this case about Scopus, but of course I will talk briefly about other data sources as well. And here there are three granularity levels. One is international, that means mobility between countries. Then international, but the level of mobility is aggregated in regional level. And then internal, inside a country, but between different regions. I will show you three exemplar cases of all states in USA, Germany, Italy, and of course, France. These are just exemplar cases, but of course, the database allows us to investigate different regions or different aggregations. So there has been previous studies or literature reviews speaking about the necessity of an integrated framework and integrated investigation of internal versus international migration and mobility. Skeldon in 2006 reviewed literature that was mainly focused on Eastern Asia, and he spoke about the necessity of taking these systems of migration into account at the same time. Why? Because they can affect each other, and sometimes an internal migration can happen and then it can follow afterwards, it can be followed up by an international migration. Or he speaks about a region being evacuated or people moving out of that region and then receiving migrants internally from, for example, other regions of the same country. And not considering these different systems of migration causes us to kind of overlook these granularities, or not to be able to disentangle these interactions between them. In science of science studies, there has been works on research trails or research pathways, if you will, by Glaser and Lauder, and they speak about how early career researchers have a trail of their own, and that trail is highly affected in the early stages of the career by, for example, their supervisor's work, or both in substance and in collaboration structure. After a while, they start to develop a more independent identity of themselves and a research trail of their own. We have taken impressions from them as well in our framework. There has been previous work on putting bibliometric data alongside demographic life events. For example, in 1987, Cole and Zuckerman did an amazing innovative work. They were asking scholars about their life events, for example, their marriage or their birth of their children, for example, divorce, for example, and other life events. And they were putting them beside the performance, a scholarly performance in terms of, for example, publications of these scholars. And they wanted to see if after controlling for those demographic life events, still the gender productivity puzzle, that is a term coined by themselves, is still holds or not. And interestingly, they were finding that no, after controlling for all those factors, we don't see a significant difference between research productivity. There has been previous work either in our institute by my colleagues or in other institutions on repurposing bibliometric data for migration research. We, of course, have reviewed those. And then there has been some works on repurposing bibliometric data for knowledge transfer that can happen in a scholarly mobility event. As an example, Aman looks at the citations, for example, that someone does not know about them before, so they don't cite them. They go for a mobility period abroad in another country. They start citing these citations. They know about them and they come back to their own country of origin, and their collaborators start citing those publications. And in an innovative research framework, she uses this trajectory to say that this mobility event contributed to this knowledge transfer. Our proposal here is to repurpose bibliometric data and to look at internal versus international mobility. And of course, we would like to look at the other side of the other side of the coin of mobility, that is scholarly collaborations and internationalized collaborations, because mobility is just one form of knowledge circulation. And some scholars are not mobile, they stay in the same country, or depending on the discipline they are working, some fields are more locally oriented and they host mobile scholars, or they form international collaborations remotely, as this talk is virtual and, for example, remotely. And in pandemic era, that is much more influential in our lives. So we know that many collaborations happen remotely as well. So we would like to take that into account. And one other point is that scholars form ties before or during their mobility event, and some of these ties persist and contribute to later mobility events or hosting international collaborators or even collaborating internationally. There is a notion of integration that we are really keen to study it, and integration during the mobility event in the host country or institution's scientific collaborations. So what sources of data do we use? For the methodological prototype that I'm going to show you, we use a Scopus web interface for April 2021. And we use publicly available CV data and ORCID profiles of the scholars as the gold standard of what could be the mobility trajectory of them. For the global scholarly mobility results that I'm going to show you, we are going to use the in-house version of Elsevier's Scopus, that is from 1996 to 2020. We have access to other databases in-house too, like Clarivate's Web of Science. But for this purpose, we are using Scopus because it delivers the address and affiliation information the way publishers give it to the Scopus. So that allows us to process it the way we wish. And I will show you some problematic cases that needs a lot of pre-processing. That Scopus data from 1996 to 2020 includes 5.4 million unique affiliations. And when we look at only article and review publications, that is about 36 million. And we take all those that are written by about 16 million scholars worldwide. So we disambiguate those organizations and then we connect them to these publications. Of course, we limit to article and review because other sources of, for example, metadata like conference proceedings or letters and these are indexed in Scopus, but they are prone to more erroneous the metadata that I will show you some examples. This data is provided to us by German Competence Center for Bibliometrics. That is where I used to do my previous postdoc fellowship. And that is given to us by Max Planck Digital Library. So there is some pre-processing needed to be done. For example, in CV information, the time entries are not coherent. Each scholar might put their own CV in the way they wish. For example, on their CV, they put the dates, for example, in different formats. It needs cleaning. Or, for example, even from web interface, the bibliometric data is not clean. I will show you examples of errors that is possible to happen. And encoding country of affiliation is not perfect as well. For organization name disambiguation, we use Research Organization Registry API. I used to evaluate it previously with other methodologies, for example, based on fuzzy text matching or exact text matching and these. And ROR gives quite reliable results. So we use that, and you can check my publication in quantitative science studies for evaluation of other methodologies beside ROR. For author name disambiguation, we use Scopus author IDs that has 98.3% precision. That means this specific profile that we are looking at does not have publication by others. And it has a 90.6% recall. That means all the publications by a specific author is included in their profile. We use geo names to geocode the affiliation addresses, and that can be the coverage of that can differ based on the countries. For example, the weird countries like Western, highly educated, North American, for example, North European countries are more represented in both ROR and in these databases and in Scopus as well. So these are, and this penalizes some other countries, for example. I will show you some visualizations that there we are minimizing the stress in network visualization to convey one point that we have in our prototype on how to integrate collaboration with mobility. In the results, I will show you net migration rates. That is the number of scholars entering a region or entering a country in a year minus the number of scholars that are exiting that country over the total number of scholars in a given year in that region or that country, multiplied by 1,000. So this is one example of CV information that comes from a publicly available CV of one scholar. And we have their affiliation country, city, start date and end date, then which university or department they were affiliated to. Below, I'm showing you for the same scholar what comes out of the bibliometric information. That is all the addresses under all their publications. And of course, we have the year of the publication. Then we have the country that this scholar had. Black lines are fine, so we can use them, they are correct. Blue lines indicated here have either country missing or the affiliation is missing. And in the red lines, the country and affiliation sometimes does not match, or the affiliation is not correct. That is scholar, it contradicts the CV. For example, that is scholar has never been in that country. Or for example, the affiliation is in Germany, but the country is United States, for example. And this requires us to do these disambiguations, for example, and pre-process this information. For example, checking all the affiliations of the scholar and seeing if that what we are observing kind of is, for example, in line with the old trend of that scholar's activity, or it is an outlier case. Here I'm showing another example. On the left, you have what is shown on the publication, for the one publication on the publisher's website. And on the right, you see what is shown on Scopus. And this is for one demographer. And she has never been affiliated to the USA. On the right, we see that Scopus shows it as University of California in Los Angeles, in demography of in Department of Geography. While on the left, we see that on the same publication, she has been affiliated to Utrecht University in Netherlands. as an example, illustrative example of how do we identify mobility events from this data. Here, I'm showing just one illustrative example of, for example, a scholar called Maria here and her publications. So we have from 1996 to 2008, a trajectory of publications, and we consider Canada as the academic birth region and country for this scholar. We know that is prone to error because that is most probably where that scholar have done their graduate studies and they do their first publication. But still, that is, we take it as a proxy of where they are trained and they are starting their publication career. And then we take the modal country of publication as the country for 1 year. For example, if a scholar has more than 3, 4, or 5, for example, different publications in a year and with different affiliations, we take the affiliation that is repeated the most in the same year, the mode affiliation as their residence. Of course, we have tried other setups, for example, looking at all the countries in 1 year and taking that into account. And the macro trends does not change because those scholars who are mobile are specific groups, and the mobility is, as I will show you in the results, is not like a dominant thing happening. So I will describe it a little bit more in the results. And we are trying to extend this a little bit further, as you will see in the prototype. So Maria has publications in 1998, 99, 2000, and in 2002, her affiliation changes from Canada to USA. And that we consider as a change of residence, a proxy for change of residence between the year 2001 and 2002. As another example, for example, Zhao has no publications in our database for the year 99 and 2000. What do is we forward or backward fill with the closest observation, the country of affiliation, to have a consistent trajectory. Why? Because, for example, as a scholar, you do your research this year and then you submit, but your publication goes through peer review, and it might, depending on the discipline, it might take, let's say, 6 months. In some disciplines, it might take 1 year. In some disciplines, like in my background discipline in sociology, it might even sometimes take more than a year, or let's say 2 years, for the publication to appear online and come out of the peer review. So this is called publication delay, and we consider that this way we are trying to say, yes, the scholars still are active and they are doing research, but the publications are coming out with a delay to the database. Here, I'm showing you one example of the prototype that we are developing. On the top, all the publications of one scholar is shown, and the layout of the network is defined in a way to put each publication on the year on a fixed X, and then to vary the other publications of the same year on different Ys, so that we can have the lowest possible stress in terms of the number of ties that are overlapping. I'm excluding the principal author from the picture above because she's an author of all these publications. So the ties that are left on the structure are shared co-authors. And you see that, for example, in 1993, she has published a publication that has a shared author with another publication in 2005 and another publication in 2006, here and here. In 2010 as well, for example. And we see in some years, for example, between year 2007 and 2008, she has publications that few of them have co-authors for the previous years. And it feels like the scholar in question is rebuilding a group of collaborators. This can signal, for example, a change in substantive area of focus. it can be a new source of funding, it can be a result of a mobility event, or multiple different factors that requires us to speak to the scholar. And we are developing methodologies to be able to survey scholars and ask them what is happening, for example, in the trajectory, as Cole and Zuckerman did in 1987. And here there are these 3 publications in 2006, 7, and 8 that are isolated. That means either they are solo author publications or they do not have a co-author that is repeated in next years, for example, or previous years. And the color of the notes are showing the communities that is based on Leiden algorithm for community detection that shows which publications are tied to each other in a more dense way than, for example, any other publication in the structure. Leiden works based on density of internal communities and contrasted with the density of any other community to meet a threshold. I can discuss more in the Q&A how it works. And then we have these blue publications that are belonging to another cluster. And of course, the gray ones that are out of these 2 clusters. And the number of countries contributing to each publication is shown by the size of the notes. So the bigger the size, the number of countries increases, and it shows the internationalized collaborations. Below on panel B, we have the mobility of the same scholar from their CV shown with the arrows. So each of those arrows shows which country the scholar was affiliated to, from which year to which year. And the red dots shows the publications. And as I said before, sometimes bibliometric data have problems. And this scholar has never been affiliated to USA based on the CV, but in the publication information, we have that, and that's an error. Then in country level, we see that this scholar has always been affiliated to the Netherlands. So she has not been mobile internationally, but when we zoom in to subnational levels, we see that this scholar has had 4 different moves: graduation in Amsterdam, a postdoc in Amsterdam, then in Utrecht in 3 different groups, then come back to Amsterdam, and afterwards an affiliation to Groningen until now. So this move from country level to subnational level allows us to see much more mobility events, and that doubles the percentage of scholars globally who are mobile from 8% to 16%. That is, and allows us to explore much more trends. So now I'm going to move to the second part of my talk on global mobility based on Scopus, data from 1996 to 2020. So here, top 50 pairs of countries are shown that in international level that include, and each of those cohorts show the number of unique scholars that are affiliated to a country, and then they move to another country. For example, United States dominates the picture with the largest number of scholars, and it has a high sending or receiving interaction with other countries in this top 50. Then on the right, I'm showing you net migration rates. Net migration rates here is shown on per 1,000 scholars. And if it is negative, that means that this country or region is sending scholars to other destinations. And when it is positive, that means they are receiving scholars. And when it is revolving around 0 line, that means there is a balance in terms of like scholars moving out and scholars moving to that region or country. And or in terms of like previous literature, there is a brain balance with, against, like, for example, instead of a brain gain or brain drain. On the right-hand side, we see that United States and Switzerland, for example, Switzerland that is here and United States that is here, have positive NMR. That means they are receiving scholars internationally. For example, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan are sending scholars internationally. So this is what we see in country level. Now I'm going to move to subnational regions. On the left, the first plot on the left, we see 50 top 50 regions in subnational level and the interactions between them internationally. So for example, the largest region is England in the UK, and the number of scholars that are moving from England to California or Ile-de-France, for example, Ontario, New York, and other regions between these top 50 pairs. In the middle, we limit the flows to be inside one country. So the largest region with the highest number of unique scholars becomes Beijing. And then the scholars that are moving from Beijing to other regions inside China, that here, for example, is Shanghai and Hubei, for example. And afterwards, on the plot on the right-hand side, I'm showing the NMR that here in subnational level shows that, for example, New York and California are receiving scholars internationally, but that is the red line, that is positive, and red shows international scholarly mobility. Blue shows internal mobility. For example, for the case of Ile-de-France, it is sending scholars both internationally, red line, that is below 0, and internally to other regions in France, that is the blue line. The smooth dashed lines show the smooth trends based on the average. And we see, for example, Berlin is a sending region as well, or England, for example, shows different trends in different years. Now I'm showing you all the states in United States. So, and this excludes some of the states that do not have any receiving or sending scholars, so they are not there. And this is 51 instead of 54. So three states are missing. One interesting observation, and the first interesting observation, is the largest range of internal mobility that is much higher than international mobility. And there are some states who are sending scholars internally to other states inside the United States. For example, Alabama, Connecticut, Delaware, Iowa, Kansas, and Louisiana, for example, or Missouri. They have blue lines under the 0 line. That means they are sending scholars to other regions inside the country. There are some states that are receiving scholars internally. That includes, for example, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, as some examples. There are some states who are receiving scholars internationally. Alaska, North and South Dakota are examples of that. For example, they have a red line above the 0 line, or South Dakota here, for example. As another example, here I'm showing you all federations or states inside Germany. On the left, this flow of scholars between these regions is shown in terms of unique number of scholars. The first observation is the states that belong to the former West German states, like Bavaria, North Rhine-Westphalia. They have the largest number of scholars, and they have the largest flows between them. And then when we look at the NMR between these regions or within in international level, we do not see a clear-cut trend as we see in the unique number of scholars. There, we have some scholars that are receiving scholars, for example, internally, for example, Brandenburg or Bremen or Hamburg. And then we have some regions that are sending scholars both internally and internationally. For example, Baden-Württemberg or Berlin, as I showed it before, or Saarland or Schleswig-Holstein. They are sending scholars, like here, for example, both internally and internationally. Here I'm showing you all the regions in in Italy, sorry. So the red lines again show the international net migration rate, and blue shows the internal. An interesting observation is that some regions are sending scholars, like Abruzzo, that is in center, Basilicate, and Calabria and Liguria, that are sending scholars internally. And Calabria and Liguria, as you know, are in south of Italy, so that and I will talk about it in my conclusions, that there are much more space for more follow-up studies on seeing, okay, what drives these trends. There are some states that are receiving scholars internally. That includes, for example, the region as Latium, Lombardy, Molise, Piedmont, and Trentino, that are a little bit more developed regions in Italy. There are some regions that, for example, Trentino, that is an exception, that before 2015 here, before 2015, it was a region that was receiving scholars internationally. That could be Italian scholars who have been trained, for example, elsewhere, like let's say abroad, and then they return back to the country. As you might be aware, Italy started in 2010, for example, offering tax exemptions or reductions to the scholars who return from abroad. Or, for example, China had 1,000 scholars policy, or some other countries like South Korea have put these policies into work to try to regain their, for example, they call it like to inspire return migration of scholars, or to to bring them back. And those are the things that we wish to explore further to see what could be the driving forces. Now I'm going to come to the region that should be much more familiar to you, that is regions in France. So I apologize in the beginning if I pronounce the names incorrectly. There are some regions that are receiving states internally, like Auvergne, Rhône, Alps, I think, Bourgogne, and then Brittany, for example, then Centre, and then Nouvelle-Aquitaine, I think, Occitanie, and Pays de la Loire. These are the ones that are receiving scholars internally. And that means they have a blue line above the 0 line. Then there are some regions that send the scholars internationally. That includes Brittany, Grand Est, Ile-de-France, and Normandy. And we needed to exclude island of Corsica because it had an outlier trend and it was causing the figures not to be clear. So one question would be, okay, what drives these mobility trends that we are observing between these regions? And that would be, and I would be keen to hear like about these regions, because, for example, about Italy, I have done my thesis on Italian scholars and Italian sociologists, and I know the internal dynamics in between them. So I can say, for example, that southern regions are sending scholars to other regions or international. And then here I summarize to say that we have curated and prepared a macro and micro global database of scholarly mobility. This gives us an unprecedented opportunity to explore some questions and integrate internal scholarly mobility with international one that Skeldon was talking about, and that allows us to understand the brain circulation that is happening and higher skilled mobility that is happening between these regions or internationally between countries in a fine-grained way. There is a necessity for disambiguation of author and organization names and addresses. As I showed you examples, there are some problematic cases, for example, that affiliation addresses are not correct, and that requires us to do a lot of disambiguation. We are hoping to prepare a database of scholarly mobility worldwide to allow other researchers to use these too. But as you might know, this, for example, Scopus is a proprietary data, and we use it based on a license and subscription. So it limits what we can publish publicly. But there are databases like, for example, ORCID that is publicly available, or Dimensions, for example, that we have replicated our results on ORCID. And we hope to take some of those databases, apply this framework, and then open it up for future use of other scholars and to allow them to investigate some of the questions that we wish to see. Of course, as I mentioned, mobility and scholarly mobility is just one side of the coin. The other side is collaboration and internationalization. Some scholars are staying in the same country, for example, they are working on the, like, for example, on a locally oriented subjects. As for example, I investigated in one study that I had on the Berlin region in Germany. There were some fields that were locally oriented, and the trend of international collaboration between them was completely different. For example, from another field that is driven by international questions, or a structure of collaborations was completely dominated by international collaborations. We need to take that into account, and that's how we are developing our methodological prototype that I showed you just one glimpse of it, but we are hoping to continue on that line to connect the mobility to collaboration. There are gender and disciplinary differences in this. For example, my colleague previously looked at the gender differences in scholarly mobility and return migration in Germany, and we are currently working on expanding that, identifying the gender using different methodologies to this global database that I showed you, so that we can explore some of the questions around that, if there are differences between the scholarly mobility between, for example, male and female scholars. And we wish to look at individual level trends of those scholars who might be underrepresented in Scopus. Why? Because Scopus is dominated by English-speaking literature. It has a lower representation and coverage of non-English speaking literature. And for example, we replicated these results using ORCID profiles, and that allows us to take into account those scholars who might not have publications like early career scholars, but they still experience mobility by, for example, being affiliated to different organizations, but they might not appear in, for example, publication corpus, or they might publish in like those journals that are not indexed by Scopus, because each of these databases have a different philosophy for their indexing. So this would allow us to see better what are, like, if these trends that we are observing is comparable in other databases or not. And we wish to do more analysis, because this year I just show you one like example of net migration rates, but to calculate and to analyze more migration-based indicators, of course, considering their limitations, as for example, Bell et al. Discussed in 2002, that some of these indicators are highly dependent on the size of the, for example, the population in question, or the number of regions that are being aggregated. And we wish to look into that a little bit more in depth and try to answer some of the substantive questions that we have on what derives, for example, these observed trends, that, for example, the trends that we observed in France or in Germany or in Italy or other countries. What derives those trends? That is what we wish to do. Thank you for your attention. And I will be really happy to hear your comments, suggestions, and yeah.
Thank you, Aliakbar. Thank you for this very interesting presentation again. So we already have some questions from Haodong. So if you want to take the floor, Haodong, go ahead. I
yes.
also have myself a couple of questions, so go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks. It's amazing to see how much work you have done. Very interesting. I have two questions. First is just for curiosity. You showed a few times there's a dip in, I think, net migration, basically people moving out of Berlin around year 2004. Do you know what's behind that? The second question is, have you tried to fit some kind of gravity model to the data you have. And you mentioned at the end, you're trying to examine some drivers of these patterns and trends. If you move on to trying to think about modeling these flows, what other factors you might consider in addition to the existing factors that has been commonly included in the gravity model, for instance? Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. They are interesting. I have to say, like the 2004 trend that you are observing, that is interesting to me too. And honestly, I know about some of the policy changes, or for example, the 2008 crisis that happened. I see the effect of that, for example, on Spain. But to be honest, we need to explore those more. And no, we haven't. Like, this is the first time we are presenting this global database in subnational level. Like my colleagues previously have presented on Mexico or in, for example, country level. They have done many studies, but this global database in subnational level, this is the first presentation on it. So I have to say that we are still exploring some of the questions that you are asking to.
It's
the
quite
second
dramatic.
thing.
Do you know anything if there's any like closing down university or something?
That could be, but I have to check that out, to be honest. Like in, for example, Berlin University Alliance, when I was checking their collaborations between their members, I was observing some trends like that, like policy changes or like a university name changes or things like that. But yeah, here I have not looked into that in detail. And gravity model that you asked, I know that, for example, my colleagues, they were working on applying gravity models on LinkedIn data, for example, on higher scale mobility based on that. I must confess here that my background is sociology of science and science of science. So I'm not a demographer, but I'm working with the smart demographers who are exactly talking about these models. And we wish to do that, like this kind of analysis that you are talking about. This would be our next steps to explore these more.
Thank you to both of you. Are there any other questions from the floor? No, so Ali, I was wondering whether you, I mean, I think the within country disaggregation is very interesting, but most interesting would be the field disaggregation, because in some fields, you do not publish in Scopus articles, journals. You publish in books or in sometimes are auto-edited books, and these books are sometimes very much read, but they are not published in these big data set. And this is most the case for humanities, for example. So is there a strong bias towards hard science in your data set, and how do you deal with that? And what would the picture be the same if you looked at it from a field perspective? And then also, I was wondering whether you could do some form of presentation of your result in the tradition of Shish. I'm sure you know this paper of Shish, which scrap from the Wikipedia or from archives the name of the city in which notable people, important people were born and where they were dead since 2000 years. So they look at how attractive are some cities in terms of brain, and how productive are some cities in terms of brain, which is basically some form of information that you could get from your data, both at the same time, the attractiveness of the city and how well they do in producing brain, which is the case of Île-de-France, for example, in your graph. So, is there a way you could maybe present, I mean, this kind of information more clearly with your data? And then I wonder whether you should take into account the size of the region when you look at the within country differences, because you look at the size of the research population by region, which is important, but the size of the region might also, I mean, when you compare England and Brittany, I mean, it's not the, or even, I don't know, Ile-de-France and California, it's not the same scale, right? So I don't know if you control for this at some point in your analysis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lisa, for these questions. They are like the first two are really in the heart of what I do, like in science of science. And field disaggregation, of course, we are going to do that. I have not yet looked at that, honestly speaking. And the first two things that we are going to take is one classification that Scopus delivers as their all science classification. And then the other is the adaptation that we have done from OECD that classifies, for example, some publications to be humanities, or for example, some other to be social sciences or natural sciences. But of course, what you say about the traditions inside these disciplines, I completely agree with that. And I understand that, for example, some fields are not scholarly like mobile, like in humanities, even their collaboration trajectory is different. Like some fields, if a PhD student or a scholar does not publish a monograph as a solo author, they are not being credited as, for example, in another field, like are publishing articles with like 5 or 6 or maybe 10 authors is the norm. So that completely is a valid point, and we have to take that, the field disaggregation, into account. And I have done it previously in other studies, but here, no, not yet. And that paper that you touched about, Ishvish, that if I understood the author name correct, no, I have not seen that. I will be really keen if you can share the name with me. I will look it up. That sounds really attractive. I would be kind of like, I would not be surprised if, for example, somewhere like Heidelberg, for example, and Heidelberg University in Germany would show that trend, as you said, for example, about Sorbonne, or for example, Ile-de-France. And okay, oh yeah, thanks a lot, 2014, okay. And that would be, yeah, that would be my, like my speculation too, that those are driving some of these trends, or the prestige of these institutions. Like in previous study that we did in sociology, we looked at the like rankings of some of these institutions and how they were collaborating or sometimes not collaborating with each other, and how they were driven by that. That I can expect that to play a role here. There has been some work before by, for example, Clauset and Larimore and others on prestige of these institutions and how powerful they are in, they call it placing, but I would call it like from the other way around, hiring. Like if their prestige is higher, then their graduates are hired on an easier, for example, let's say way by other prestigious institutions. And that plays a lot of role in this kind of deriving these patterns that we are observing. And the size of the regions that you mentioned, in the NMR calculation, we take the number of scholars affiliated in a region in each year into account. But I'm not a demographer, but I can completely see that that could be optimized in terms of like more fine-grained indexes that would allow for that. But at the moment, it was just yearly number of all scholars affiliated to a region or a country taken into account. And I don't know if I missed something.
No, it's perfect. No. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions.
Is there any other questions from the floor? Yes, Marion?
Yes, hi, thank you, Ali, and thank you both for the two presentations. Just a quick question. The thing that you presented on within country mobility. I think it's very original, and we're not used to see this type of data. So it's very interesting to have gathered that. I was wondering, what is your intuition on what this information, which type of information this can give on, let's say, the general dynamism of the academia in the country, because there are a lot of things that are very context specific. So you talked about Italy, about France, and it's but to try to go beyond context specificities, do you think that this internal migration can give some information in general on research in the country? And does it, for instance, correlate with some country level outcomes that you may think of in terms of research or I don't know, academia in general?
Absolutely. One thing that we are doing in another project is taking these countries, like, for example, the level of development that they have or other factors into account. And some of the results of that, we have submitted it to Population Association of America, PAA, next year. That shows that what we are observing among scholars is not similar to what the literature has been showing about general population, that by the increase in GDP, for example, the scholarly mobility and the outflow of, for example, scholars going out of these regions was increasing to a point, and afterwards, it was not following the same shape that we see in the general population. That would make complete sense. I would kindly tell you to have a look at the paper by my colleagues on Mexico, because there they did that in taking some census information on general population, connecting that to these results on scholars and scholarly mobility, because those questions you are asking are valid and they can be explored exactly with merging these data sources. To address the last part of your point on academia in these countries and academic systems, some of them are dominated by private universities and the contract types. For example, for Germany, like as much as, for example, I know it a little bit better, the postdoc fellowships after PhD graduations cannot go beyond, for example, 6 years. That affects the German population, for example, of scholars to early career scholars to kind of like either go out of the country or to go out of academia. These play major roles. Or, for example, in what we did, for example, in Italy, some policy changes in national level drives differences in behavior in terms of collaboration or in terms of publication. Or here, I would not be surprised if that changes their mobility too. There was one work that was showing after the policy implication for tax exemption, there were scholars returning to Italy. And I would not be surprised to see that in between the regions too. Like if, for example, I don't know, like the regions that were previously sending, like southern regions, receive more scholars, or the scholars tend to return simply because new policies might allow or fund, for example, their universities. But those are exactly the questions we need to explore. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Ali. Audrey, go ahead.
Yes, I just have a very quick question regarding gender. I think it's one of your future lead for research. I'm not really sure, maybe I missed that, but do you have the gender of the scholar in your database? And I mean, whether you have any intuition about how mobility, scholarly mobility might differ by gender. I think that would be a very important and interesting area of research.
So what we are doing currently, no, these databases does not come with gender, for example, or age. For age, for example, we infer it by the first year of publication, and then we call it academic age, and then we develop cohorts of scholars who start their academic career at the same time. For gender, we infer that based on the first names, and that is prone to error, but still try to do that with multiple different, for example, available APIs, like contrasting them with each other. And previously we have curated like databases of like about 5,000 scholars and manually assigning their genders. And we use that as a training set to see if our gender identification algorithm works the way we wish, or for example, it is prone to error. And still that is working like to a lesser degree in some countries, like Andrea, for example, in Italy would be a man, but Andrea in Eastern Europe can be a woman's name, for example, or in some other countries that could be different. So these, but how can I say, there are not much possibilities to do that otherwise, because of the larger scale of the data. Like here we have 16 million scholars. And to answer your question about if we have done that in Germany, yes, there was a much different flow of migration between female scholars. And there is a preprint by Xinyi, Zhao, Emilio, Samin Aref, and Guy Sketlov on archive that they, and I think it is already under review, what they were looking there was that the German female scholars were showing more mobility. So that was like outflow of them. And that was kind of surprising, but surprising when we look at that in like, what's it called? Thinking that it is a playing field of like being able to stay in the same country. But many of them move out of the academia, and that is where the cohort analysis helps us. If, for example, someone comes, publishes, and then they just do not publish anymore, so we can assume that as moving out of the academia. And no, but to be clear here, we have not done it in this database, but those are things that we need to explore more. And then check if because for example, in international level, I have myself observed the outflow of active scholars in publishing, that the outflow of those who are going out of the system is much higher in case of women scholars than, for example, men scholars. But if we will observe that here as well or not, that's something we need to check.
Thank you very much. Is there any final question from the floor? No? Okay, so I think we can end the session now. Again, thank you very much, Ettore and Aliakbar, for your presentation. I think it was really interesting for us to know more about your works. And so hopefully we'll see you again in some of the ICM events, seminars, or whatever. Aliakbar, if you wish, we can include you as well in the mailing list if you want to receive the information about the scientific life of the ICM. Well, thank you for also all of you who stayed. I've seen that some have already left because we are a bit late on the schedule, but thank you for all of those who stayed until the end, and see you soon.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Audrey. Thank you. Bye bye.